Hi guys and welcome to History of Infection. This time we're looking at a virus that could possibly be a plot from a horror movie. Ebola. Ebola is a virus that has quite horrific symptoms. It's a hemorrhagic fever, which means you start bleeding from essentially everywhere that you have a membrane, a sort of body of tissue, will start producing blood. Hemorrhagic fevers perhaps related to 4 or 5 different viruses, but for the sake of today I'll just be talking about Ebola. Ebola is by no means alone in the hemorrhagic fever virus category. There's Marburg and Lassa fever, just to name a few. Now here's what I find quite interesting about this virus. They kill people. That might not sound particularly shocking, but bear with me. They kill people so quickly and effectively and in such a manner that often the host die before the virus has had a chance to be transmitted to another host, which is bad for the virus. A recurring theme in the series is the interest between the host and the pathogen and how they vary sometimes, and even sometimes how they come together. A pathogen wants to reproduce. A host doesn't want to lose resources supporting a pathogen. Anthropomorphisms aside, anything that doesn't maximize its fitness will likely not be selected. A pathogen that kills its host before it's had a chance to spread will not proliferate as quickly as a pathogen that kills slower. Of course, there are a few principles here that have been oversimplified for a nice easy explanation. First is the idea that transmission requires the infection to grow inside the host. So the transmission is linked to how much damage the bacterial virus does. Coupled with this is the idea that the pathogen somehow has to damage the host to get these nutrients required to grow and proliferate out of the host. Second assumption is that the symptoms of a disease state can either help or suppress a pathogen. For example, sneezing tends to help a pathogen that's spread through the air because it helps the transmission, whereas inflammation and fevers tend to reduce the pathogen by damaging it and damaging the cell tissues around it so that they essentially destroy the pathogen. These assumptions might not be 100% accurate, but it does give us a nice easy way to think about how infections might progress and who has interest in doing what in certain points of infection. So Ebola virus doesn't seem to fit nicely within these rules we've constructed. Now there are two things we can do here. We can say that our theory isn't good enough. It doesn't actually correctly identify and think about how pathogens really work in this manner. Or something else might be going on here. This pathogen might not be evolved to have maximum fitness in a primate mammalian host. Our best theory about Ebola is that primates are not the normal host of the virus. They're not the reservoir of typical infections, and they only accidentally get infected by the actual normal carriers of the disease. It's believed that bats are the natural reservoir of the virus. However, there seems to be a problem here that the virus doesn't seem to actually make the bats particularly sick. Now, it might be that they've evolved together for such a long time that effectively the virus doesn't do anything to them, but can still be transmitted from one person to the other, so they might only have a bat cold. Or perhaps the virus is just using the bat as a carrier. One very cool thing is we found fossilized genetic evidence of a Ebola-like virus that evolved along lines with hamsters. A bit off topic, but very cool. Another one of these sort of fossilized viruses inside our own genomes is responsible for stopping a mother's immune system from being able to attack a baby through the placenta. The building of the placenta is helped along by this ancient virus, and it effectively causes the cells to close all the junctions around them and form a really tight seal, so none of the immune systems can get in. What does Ebola do to make you bleed so profusely? Ebola actually attacks part of your immune system, and it attacks your immune cells. Instead of making you immune compromised, which it may do over a very long time if it didn't kill us so quickly, it makes the immune cells release cytokines. In earlier videos I've talked about cytokines being the sort of signaling molecule. They help your immune system know where to go. They tell your immune system to go over there and kill that pathogen. Immune cells need to get from point A to point B. They're not always at a certain site of infection. They tend to travel through your body's lymphatic and blood vessels and find their way to active sites of infection. Then when they get there, they need to get out of these vessels and into your cells. And this means that they have to tell the membranes forming the vessels to move apart to allow them in. They do this by releasing cytokines, and the cells nearest the area sense these molecules and become less tight so that the immune cells can literally slip through them. The Ebola virus makes your immune cells release these cells without any sort of negative feedback. So all of a sudden your immune cells start releasing all these cytokines that tell all the cells in the vessels to go loose. And of course what happens then is the vessel collapses and what was inside the vessel comes outside the vessel and you start bleeding profusely. Horrifying as that is, blood loss isn't typically the cause of mortality in Ebola cases. It tends to be from multiple organ failure, probably due to the lack of blood getting to the organs, but it tends to be multiple organ failure that tends to kill people. Also, you tend to see DIC, which is disseminated intravascular coagulation. Essentially, your blood just clots throughout your body. Even with treatment, this is fatal 50% of the time. So how long ago was Ebola discovered? A better question might be, how long has it remained hidden from us? I'm going to skip over the idea that these sort of fevers and diseases are well documented throughout history. I'm not necessarily disputing these ideas, they are different stories, and hopefully one day I will definitely give them their due. Ebola was discovered and formally identified in 1976 by David Finks. It derives its name from the Ebola River in Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The first description of the virus was by a doctor whose name I'm going to butcher, Dr. Ngoy Mushola. One of the first encounters was in the small village of Yambuka. On the 26th of August, the world became aware of a new terror. A number of villagers had seemingly bled to death with no apparent trauma. They just began bleeding profusely. The manner in which the Ebola virus attacks its host means that the gastrointestines tend to bleed most, and this means you vomit up blood quite dramatically. The local hospital attempted to treat the patients. However, 11 out of the 17 members of staff who worked at the hospital, the 17 members in total who worked at the hospital, 11 of them died shortly afterwards. The local Belgian nunnery also had many casualties from this bizarre virus. Thankfully, the World Health Organization swooped in and in a remarkable managerial skill managed to quarantine the local villages, stopping the virus from spreading any further. In total, 318 people were infected with the virus. Only 38 survived. Let's now skip ahead to another outbreak in Africa, and I want to introduce you to a man who I have a lot of respect for. Dr. Matthew Lukwiya. Dr. Lukwiya had a very interesting life and seemed really and truly to practice an ethical manner of treatment, in so much that he put his own welfare below that of his patients. His life is more interesting than I can do justice to. I suggest you go look him up and read about him because he's truly quite remarkable. In the year 2000, he was alerted to the death of 2 of his female student nurses. They had died from vomiting up blood, it seemed. He was then informed entire families in the local area were dying of profuse bleeding, and he did a bit of quick research and found that the most likely cause was the Ebola virus. Instead of going through the typical bureaucracy channels of going up to different supervisors, he went straight to the Minister of Health for the country and managed to get him to send a reaction team. And they also requested help from the World Health Organization. The virus was confirmed in a South African lab, and in accordance with World Health Organization guidelines, they set up an isolation ward. The first question was who would staff this ward. 13 members of his staff volunteered and stepped forward, Lukwiya leading the way as well. When the World Health Organization arrived, they were incredibly surprised to find how effective their management of the Ebola outbreak was being. They thought they were going to walk in and see all sorts of things that were going wrong and just not working to prevent the spread of the disease. Dr. Simon Mardle, a member of the World Health Organization team, stated, "I had thought people would be unwilling to work. I thought we would be facing a situation where patients were totally neglected and an isolation ward to which people wouldn't want to come. It would just be a mortuary." But they had implemented the manual, a very specialised recipe. They were giving highly sophisticated care. It was remarkable. There was even a little wooden device for pulling boots off they had made, exactly as the manual described. Dr. Lukwiya led by example. He worked over 12-hour days in direct contact with patients with Ebola, and Ebola is spread through droplets of bodily fluids, and these people are vomiting and coughing up tiny droplets of this infected blood. At one stage, his staff tried to quit after more and more of their number were killed off by the virus, and the tension finally broke when 2 members of staff who hadn't been in contact with the isolation ward became sick and died. Almost the entire staff sat down and refused to work. Lukwiya managed after many hours to encourage them and enthuse them in such a way about their medical responsibility that they came back to work. He had previously said, "It is our vocation to save life. It involves risk. But when we serve with love, that is when the risk does not matter so much. When we believe our mission is to save lives, we have got to do our work." The meeting ended with the staff agreeing to come back to work, and they broke into song. 2 days later, the doctor was treating a member of staff who had begun coughing up blood. Dr. Lukwiya was woken up and told of this interaction and decided to go visit the patient who was a colleague of his. He put on his protective gear apart from his goggles and face visor. It is likely that this interaction with this patient sealed his fate. Within 3 days, he was himself in the isolation ward, and although he seemed to be recovering, his heart rate and oxygen were going up. He began to develop lung hemorrhages, which is the worst kind of hemorrhage and the most fatal in the Ebola virus. He died shortly afterwards. A total of 173 deaths occurred during this time, and a large number of those were from the medical team trying to save people. I think possibly more lives could have been prevented if the medical team hadn't intervened in such a way. I don't know, but it's possible they could have let the infection run their course and let people die off naturally and just quarantined everyone. However, these people cared so much about treating their patients that they were willing to put their lives at risk. Also, the care that that hospital was able to provide meant that the survival rate was up to 50%, whereas previously in other outbreaks the survival rate had been low as 10%. The treatment and fast action isolation organised by Lukwiya is in a very big part as to why that drop in the rate of mortality happened. So that brings us to the end of this history infection. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next time I'll be talking about the Great Demise, something that affects us all at one stage in our life. I'm going to be talking about death. I hope you join me then. Thanks for watching.